Community Church of Boston. This is our first event since the new year, so Happy New Year, everybody. And we really are hoping to continue with the work. We have a very good news to share today. We just signed the lease for our first floor tenant, so that deserves a big round of applause for everybody who participate, help, give us guidance, and help us with everything. So because of that, we also would like to light a candle that will help us to remember some of our past friends and heroes and members of the church that had contributed to a lot of these success for the 104 years that we are going. As a community church, we have many challenges, many opportunities, and then definitely is one of the reasons that we want to commemorate people that had passed, and one of those will be our Saquambanceris, heroes of patrons of our church, so and many other people that had helped, like Jim Casters, and then we just have also Dean asked me to mention Jimmy Carter, which could be an interesting fellow, but definitely I think the part that was very important was the international solidarity that showed with denouncing the Cuban blockade, allowing other peoples to communicate and understand that the US policies are not necessarily the best, but definitely help to create a little bit more conscience around the world for that. So because of that, we want to start our program today, introducing Mark and Matt.
Could I mention one other person?
Sure.
Important to us who passed recently, which is Mark Solomon. Yes, because there was an announcement that next Saturday at 1 o'clock in Newton, there's going to be a memorial service for Mark Solomon. I think you probably all know who he was. He was a wonderful activist and speaker and scholar.
Yes, and he was also a very frequent participant of our activities here in the church. So thank you very much, Victor, for reminding us him. And then now I would like to introduce Mark Ridley, a bass, and Matt Hull, a trumpet. They had visited us many times, and they just shared with me that they had been playing music since high school. So let's welcome them, and let's start our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that piece. I really appreciate the nice music. And thank you. And just to continue with what always Dean is very good at it, is remind us that the upcoming events. So then we will have shortly we will have the Daniel Davalos. Actually, if you don't forget to pick up your newsletter. You probably received that in the mail already, but if not, please pick it up. We're going to have a conversation the next Sunday with Daniel Davalos. He will be talking about Kawal. Kawal is a word in the Chiapas area for indigenous people and how they actually create a sustainable economy and how to recreate that. So we will have also Patrick Parr, and that he will be, let's see, Patrick Parr, and of course Arpeña on the 11th, that we will be celebrating, commemorating the Cuban Revolution and the solidarity with Palestine. Also, we will have the Norman Finkelstein, my apologies. He will be talking about on Gaza, Lebanon, Israel and Iran. So you will find more information in the newsletter. And as tradition, Dean always read from the Galeano book. And January 5th today, The Land That Speaks. And say, George Washington Carver dreamed about God. Ask of me whatever you wish God offer. Carver asked him to reveal the secrets of peanuts. Ask the peanuts, God told him. George, a child of slaves, dedicated his life to resurrecting lands slain by the slave plantation. And in his laboratory, which looked like an alchemist's kitchen, he developed hundreds of products made from peanuts and sweet potatoes, oils, cheese, butter, sauces, mayonnaise, soap, stain, dyes, inks, syrups, glues, and talcum. The plants tell me, he explained, they will talk to anyone who knows how to listen. When he died on this day in 1943, he was nearly 80 years old and still handling our recipes and advice, still teaching in a unusual university, the first in Alabama to accept students who were black. So thank you for your patience with me today. And we will ask Matt and Max to share another piece of music. Thank you.
That first piece was Morning Song by the great Ornette Coleman, one of me and Matt's biggest heroes and inspirations. And we played it because it's the morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. And this next song is written by Matt Hull. And it's called The Call.
The Call. Hope you enjoy it.
Thank you.
Happy New Year. In case you didn't get the reference.
I don't know if you guys can hear it on Zoom, but the coffee maker is making this really cool noise. Kind of wish it was up here. We could put a mic on it.
Thank you very much for that music. Let's give it another applause for sharing that music with us. Thank you, Max. Thank you, Max. And to continue with our program today, it's a great pleasure to introduce a dear friend, Suren Moodlier. Fortunately, due to weather conditions, he could not travel last night, and he will be joining us via Zoom. He is a speaker as co-editor. He's speaking as a co-editor with Professor Charles Derber of the essay collection "How We Win." This talk reviews why Trump won at the polls and outlines how the left projects may build on one and another in the coming period. Suren brings a campaign background in housing, labor, and corporate accountability to his organizing work. This is also influenced by his deep appreciation for diverse communities and respect of their histories. This has driven his long life organizing and publishing his stories in history. Suren is from South Africa, where the struggle against apartheid provided his formative experience. So many of us has the pleasure to have worked with him in multiple projects. So I guess we will be very happy to hear him today. So let's welcome him to join us. He will be joining us via Zoom. Thank you.
Hi, Sandra. Hi, everyone. Just want to make one slight correction. Can you all hear me? Okay.
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So Charlie Derber is going to go first. You have his biography, Sandra, in your email.
My apologies. Okay. So then, Charlie. Okay. Okay. Charlie, are you connected? Let's see. Okay. Yeah, we can make him co-host. Okay. No, I don't have that. Actually, Soren, do you mind to introduce Professor Derber?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to introduce Charlie Derber, with whom many of us have worked for many years on very many different projects. I'll read from his biography that we attached to the book, How We Win. Charlie Derber is a renowned intellectual and lifelong activist for human and environmental rights. A sociology professor at Boston College, he teaches courses on political economics and social issues, and shares his research through podcasts and videos. He has authored 23 books, including bestsellers on capitalism, inequality, war, corporate power, and the climate crisis. His recent works include Welcome to the Revolution and Democracy in Perilous Times. Charlie lives with his wife in Boston, Massachusetts. Charlie.
Hi there. Oh, thank you very much for the introduction, Suren. It's wonderful to see you. And thank you all for having us. I just want to say, can you guys hear me okay? I'm hearing a slight echo. Are you okay? Can you hear okay? Yes, okay, good.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to say first what a pleasure it is to see Suren, and what wonderful good fortune it was to collaborate with Suren on this book, because he brings a unique intellectual activist melding that was so important for a book like this. I'm glad I'm in a warm office here at Boston College, and Suren looks like he's out in the Syracuse snow. So I hope Suren is actually feeling as warm as I'm in my office, and that you guys are warm. It's a cold winter. Climate change surfaces in bouts of extreme cold, as well as lots of hot weather. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes before I turn it over to Suren. And, you know, this was not an easy book to write emotionally, because it's about the issue of extinction, and sort of makes the argument that we've entered an era that humanity has not faced before, which is the prospects, the very real prospects of human extinction in a relatively short period of time. And to write about extinction, when I first thought about this, I was thinking about the book that Ernest Becker wrote called The Denial of Death, which some of you may know from way back in the 1950s, I think it was. And he argued that the sort of fundamental impulse of human beings is to deny the reality of death. And it's interesting, Chris Hayes of MSNBC has just written a book that's he argues that capitalism sort of attracts our attention with all kinds of glitzy things, because we don't want to really focus on nothing, which in Hayes's term sort of opens up the reality of the mind to face death. And he said basically that's such a difficult thing to do, that we allow ourselves to be constantly seduced by our mind just flipping from one commodity to another, one frivolous event to another to avoid thinking about the real issue of life, which ultimately is that we're all facing death. So this book is looking at even a broader issue than individual death, which is difficult enough to deal with, which is collective death. The idea that all of humanity could, by virtue of both denial, which is what Becker wrote about, the denial of our collective death, and by virtue of the fact that, as we argue in this book, that we're being moved in this direction by, a system, the capitalist system and other systems that are intertwined with it, which are basically bearing down full weight upon us. And so we're not only facing the terror of just thinking about extinction, the very real prospect of collective death. And the fact that it's, I guess the fact that this is being brought on us by a system, an economic and political and cultural system that we've helped create, gives a little bit of hope in the sense that if this is something that has been produced by the dominant political economy of our age, it's also a system that can be changed. Obviously, an enormously big task, but given the given the denialism that's so powerful, and of course Trump is coming in full steam with climate denialism, and so it's not like we wrote this book a year before, about a year and a half ago it was published, and it was before Trump was elected. The prospects are more grim now than they were, just a year and a half ago. But again, one of the reasons that I think it was so wonderful to have Suren engaged with this project is that he finds a way to bring hope and in a creative and credible way. So there's a good chunk of this book that Suren wrote, which is about prospects for dealing with extinction and the kinds of social change and social movements that have some prospect for making a difference. So with that said, I just want to say a little bit about the sort of before the sort of change dynamic, which is such an important part of the book, about what kind of politics and what kind of personal life we can live in an era of extinction. I just want to talk about a little bit about the analytical framing of this. And this book is called Dying for Capitalism. You can see it. I don't know if you've seen it, but actually this really, I think, beautiful cover was designed by Suren. And so Suren could have had a career as a book designer. And on page 25 of the book, this is a chapter 1, which we call the Extinction Triangle. And it sets the analytical framework for the whole analysis of the book. So I'm going to just show you a triangle. I don't know if you can see this, but at the top of the triangle is capitalism. And going down, the arrows are causal arrows going down toward environmental death on one side and military death on the other. And what this triangle basically, there's a very simple version of it here, where it just has capitalism, environmental destruction, and militarism at the 3 points of the triangle. And what this book basically does is, were you able to see the diagram could you see the triangle? Yeah, okay. So basically the book really expands on this triangle, and in 2 ways. One, it looks at it in a global sense, looking at how climate change and environmental destruction and military destruction are intersectionally, systemically intertwined, and how we can't really deal with the crisis of extinction without coming to terms with this triangle, understanding it, understanding the interlinks and the political and economic roots of how this triangle works. And then the second part of the book looks at the United States as the primary engine nationally, the most important country driving extinction. We call it the Extinction Nation, which gives us a special responsibility living in the United States because what the United States does in regard to these issues is going to help shape what happens obviously in the world more so than any other country. And then the third part of the book deals with how we can fundamentally change the systems that are propelling us faster and faster toward extinction. So I just want to, I think for most of people who are here today, I think the analytical framework is not terribly surprising to you. I mean, you may not have quite thought of it this way, but the basic idea is that capitalism as a system is driving environmental destruction, meaning climate change, but also biodiversity and a range of other environmental changes, which are going to make the environment less and less hospitable to human life. And capitalism also drives military interventionism and war, which in a nuclear and biological age, the greatest risk of extinction on that side is the risk of escalation from conventional to nuclear war, which we see now, for example, in Ukraine, possibly if Trump comes in and there's a war with Iran. It's very hard to know, but clearly both of these outcomes, environmental destruction and military destruction, in our view, are being driven in the world we have today and in the United States by the particular model of capitalism that we labor under. So the book really expands on that argument. We should say, if you look at the bottom part of the triangle, it also points out that the climate change and militarism are also causally interrelated. That's often, I think, less widely understood, that that military intervention and military spending is among the greatest drivers of climate change, and climate change is among the greatest drivers of militarism. Just a little comment on that. The Pentagon is legally required every year to specify the greatest national security threat to the country. And for the last several years, they have been describing climate change as the largest threat to the current national security. But they don't mention that, the Pentagon itself is the single biggest institutional producer of carbon emissions in the world. And the US military, simply to train, to buy its parts, to do its training, it's so much as aviation, and war itself is enormously destructive of the environment. At the same time, the environmental changes tend to generate population pressure on less and less habitable land. About 60% of the world lives about 60% from a coast. And so as water rises, people are forced out and have to find habitable land. That often produces conflict. And recent genocidal wars, as in Rwanda and Darfur, are now increasingly seen as related to climate change as well. So it's important to point out that I think the intersection of militarism and climate change is very important in itself. And again, this is very important for the United States because the United States is both a leading driver of carbon and climate change and also a leader, the military hegemon, perhaps a declining hegemon, but still the most powerful and most militaristic nation ever seen in the world. In regard to the economic system, the book really, both historically and in terms of looking at the United States today, sort of lays out why capitalism breeds both, environmental death, and particularly we're looking at climate change here, and militarism. And I think the argument will be, this part of the argument will be relatively familiar to many of you, that on the one hand, capitalism, if we look at war, the drive for profit, for resources, for cheap labor, for foreign markets, always drives capitalist societies toward some form of militarism so that, profit can be secured, usually at the expense of vulnerable global countries in the global South. And the history of colonialism sort of plays that out. And American hegemony since World War II has played that out even more clearly. And we're still seeing, obviously, large parts of that today. On the climate change and environmental front, the rate of relation of capitalism to climate change, again, it starts with profit as the central role, which turns environmental consequences and social destruction as kind of externalities. They're not something that the market has to take account of. So they're costs that are externalized, and that's kind of built into American capitalism and to most forms of capitalism, more in America than others. And what makes America particularly distinctive is that the cultural and political economy have been so hostile to the kind of public investment in public goods that would create public transportation, which would make an enormous difference for saving the environment. Cars, the whole power of the corporate industry over our housing, our lifestyle, the fact that, Marx wrote about the fetishism of commodities. We sort of eroticize commodities, takes our attention, and we live in suburbs, away from people, away from cities. And this is all part of a kind of American formula for capitalism that breeds a lot of profit, since everything is turned over to the profit sector. And with Mr. Musk and Ramaswamy in the coming years, I think we're going to see efforts to do this at a level that we hadn't imagined possible before, as we cut public spending, public goods, public investment, and turn everything over to the markets, which will increasingly, intensify climate change, environmental destruction, and despite Trump's sort of anti-war periodic rhetoric, probably intensify extinction risks related to militarism. In his first term, Trump tore up nuclear agreements and massively invested in nuclear modernization and putting tactical weapons, nuclear weapons, up near the Russian front, which is a powder keg right now. So I think, we're facing, as we move into Trump, not only, corporate oligarchy of a more exposed and intense form than we've seen in, many years. It sort of back to Reagan and back to the Gilded Age. And I think what people I think understand that this is going to be an economic disaster, but that it also has really, really important ramifications for both for climate change and the environment and for war. And it's the one thing I want to say about that I didn't mention about environmental destruction is that the corporate world deals with these issues by treating them not as systemic problems related to the economic system or the political system, but as technological problems. So, for example, focusing somebody like Bill Gates, liberal corporate world, what Trump calls the woke corporate world, treats climate change it will acknowledge climate change, but treats it as a technological problem. So Musk thinks that electric cars will solve this problem along with many other technological. He doesn't really think it. He's developing his space capability because he's often said that the Earth may not survive and that he wants to make other planets inhabitable for human beings. So maybe at some level he recognizes that technology is not the full solution. But we lay out, but I think it's what may interest some of you, the ways in which technological solutions, while important, I mean, technology is obviously a really important force in looking at capitalism and environmental change. It's hardly a solution that as long as capitalism is committed to endless growth, I mean, basically, it's a system dedicated to infinite profit in a finite set of land and resources. And ultimately, those two are not reconcilable. If you're trying to extract infinite resources and infinite growth on a finite planet, you're going to need another planet unless you reconfigure capitalism in a way that's consistent with the finite realities of the world we live in. So that's kind of, I don't want to go on very long, except to say that because the United States, our per capita carbon emissions are higher than any other country in the world. Comparing ourselves to Europe, we have a much worse environmental profile for reasons that you're probably familiar with. And of course, the military hegemonic power of the United States, while our economy is in decline, our military is, it's a bipartisan commitment. Biden's endless commitment to supporting these wars in the Middle East and in Russia has been just a horror, and emblematic. Harris's inability to critique them as well has turned both parties, as they have been for, since World War II, they've been war parties. They're both corporate parties. So we're facing a situation now where when the ultimate problem is extinction, we really need, a major, massive social movement that is focusing on this crisis of extinction that can deal with the denialism that we all confront. If we feel a stomach ache, we get very focused on it. If we think about climate change destroying much of the world in 30 years, it becomes very abstract. So the problem is that denialism, if we can deny our own death in the way that Ernest Becker wrote, we can certainly deny collective death until it's, it's just way too late. So this is where I'd like to turn it over to Suren, because he played a major role in sort of a very creative way of thinking about how does one deal with the magnitude of the problem and the kind of political structural barriers as well as the psychological barriers that prevent us from creatively and rapidly dealing with this unbelievable crisis. So, Suren, I would want to turn it over to you, and thank you again for working with me on this project.
Thank you, Charlie. For everyone attending, Charlie spoke to a book that we worked on, which was, dealing with extinction. We followed the book, however, with a new one called How We Win: Energizing Strategies, Voters, and Agendas, which was a co-edited work. I would like to talk to all of you about the book and what it contains. So let's go to that really quickly. I am sharing my screen with a slide presentation, which I'll use for the remaining 20 minutes of our formal presentation. How We Win is a collection of works from a number of different thinkers, and I'll walk you through the process. Before we get into this, rather arrogant title, How We Win, I'd like to just say what I'm not really going to talk about. And for that, I'm going to go back to this issue, the election outcome. The election outcome in some ways was remarkable, in other ways, not so remarkable. Fourth smallest winning margin since 1960. And if you recognize that Harris only had to win in 4 of the 7 swing states, a mere 90,000 voters in either Arizona or North Carolina could have swung the election in the other direction, and correspondingly smaller margins for everyone else. As a result, when we look back at this election and think about the outcome, it allows us for a million different explanations, because you only have to explain why this or that block of 60,000 voters went one way instead of the others. Therefore, when people talk about winning the TikTok election in which Trump won 55% of the youth vote as opposed to 42% of Harris's, you are then sort of coming up with viable explanations to only explain that are based on only small amounts. Therefore, Harris's failure to appear and Trump's appearance on Joe Rogan was also critical in determining this. It all depends on which 40 to 60,000 votes you want to explain. The same thing about the effect, the Elon Musk effect, man who spent $277 million on electing Trump. That's of his own money. If billionaires actually have money that could be described as their own. In addition, of course, the most common explanation, the cost of groceries. We could also think about some other explanations, like the fact that the investments made by the Inflation Reduction Act went to the wrong workers, a small number of industrial workers who didn't turn out for Harris anyway. And of course, the real fact of Genocide Joe. Could the party of Genocide Joe ever win an election? However, what we decided to do was to focus our book on the fact that we considered this election an election that was based on the existential threat posed by the victory of Trump without giving a free ride to the opponent, right? We could recognize that Trump's victory poses an existential threat to humanity. However, we are not saying that the corresponding opposite, that Harris's winning, does not pose a threat. All we're recognizing is that there's one opponent that we'd rather face than the other. So before I go on, though, I do want to also recognize that this talk in many ways is influenced by a friend to, I think, most people in this room, the virtual room and in the actual physical space of the community church. Mark Solomon, who died on December 19, had one big idea that he impressed upon all his allies: the capacity to frame your work to appeal to the largest number of people. I first met Matt back in 2004 when we were organizing the Boston Social Forum, and then Mark arranged to bring people like Angela Davis to be main speakers at the Social Forum, and did a lot of work for it. Again, it was about the idea was, how do we build this biggest united front that we need to build, right? So the book that we're talking about, How We Win, is in large part about building that kind of united, or more technically speaking, popular front that is needed. So the book itself is based on a previous work we wrote in 2020 called Turnout: Mobilizing Voters in an Emergency. So a large number of the contributors came back to provide new new pieces for the election. So we frame this book as addressing the emergency election. And an emergency election is what we believe to be an election with an existential character. The election certainly in the 1930s had this existential character, as did the one that elected Abraham Lincoln in 1860. So I won't say much more about it, but get further into the book. The election occurs in the following context, right? Catastrophic climate breakdown, which is already well underway, right? Global militarism and the threat of terminal war, which Charlie mentioned. The fact of democratic decay. You know, the Great Revolution of 1789 is now sort of succeeded by a case where popular election is held, the people who win the majority in the election are simply ignored, and the president appoints his own governing prime minister to run the country. So that even so-called bourgeois democracy has very little to do with democracy anymore. Correspondingly to their fascist electoral wins, there are emergent social movements, however, that give us hope. The labor movement in some ways in the United States is resurgent, and so are the environmental justice movement and community rebuilding. All of these are topics that we address in the book because we address strategies, voters, and agendas. So I'll just walk you through the book really quickly before saying a little bit more substantive things that correspond to the way the talk was advertised to you. Here's the table of contents to the book, right? It's a lot of different essays. I'll point out a few. Charlie Derber, for example, has an essay entitled The Fascist Threat and the Progressive Agenda. Chuck Collins, who many people in Boston know, wrote about billionaires and their influence on the election, which proved to be, unfortunately, all too predictive of the future. Mary Trainor and Rebecca Garrard, grassroots activists, talk about the right to housing at the local level and at the national level, but they also speak about the housing movement and the victories that could be had by the housing movement. Our co-editors, Matt Nelson and Nancy Trevino, speak about the flow of resistance, in which they address the critical role that border communities had in this election. And as you know, many of the border communities, including majority Latino communities, went for Trump. So something interesting there. We also have a number of other essays, including ones about the labor movement that I'm going to say a little bit more about. We, however, have a focus on the local, the essays by Helen Gim, a Philadelphia councilwoman, on restoring democracy through our public schools, in which she talks about her concrete work with public education in Philadelphia. Same thing with, say, Maurice Mitchell of the Working Families Party, who reflects on his work at the local level. I would also want to say that we had a number of pieces, but all of these pieces written well before the election, before Harris supplanted President Biden, these were about actual movements and agendas, and as such, they have a lot of they inform an agenda for the future, what has to be defended and protected as we move forward. We also have some essays that are online, and I'll show you them really quickly. So one on engaging the TikTok generation, which again is very predictive given the way the youth vote went. Medea Benjamin's piece, Faraway Places and Conflicts at Home. And a whole lot of other topics on the role of AI, tech supremacy, by Rajesh Kasturirangan, who lives in the Boston area too. So all of these essays are available for free on the emergencyelection.org website. And in addition, I should say that should you want to have any of the chapters of the election, of this book on the that we've published, you can email me at my address, suren@fairjobs.org, and I'll be glad to send it to you. The website above that, telos.co, I put it in the chat, is one with a lot of different writings that I've contributed to. So let me go back, though, and talk about the forward-looking dimensions based on this book. How are we to rebuild our movement? If you look at this book, one of the areas in which you place a lot of weight is on working with the labor movement. I think, it's not a controversial point to say we need to work with the labor movement. Unfortunately, a lot of the social movement left does not have real ties with the labor movement, and we need to figure out how to build it. 3 of the essays in our book address this problem. If we talk about the social movement left and the labor movement, among the things we need to consider is not merely the fact that many people in the social movement left don't address issues that are directly at the core of the labor movement, but also the fact that the labor movement has often not been a very welcoming space. So I'll say a little bit more about that point. Another point that we'd like to raise is, that I'd like to raise about rebuilding the movement, is understanding the role of educational institutions, both at the higher and at the high school and primary school level education, the relationships between educational institutions and the community. I addressed this point in an essay I wrote for this volume on violence, and in which I talk about the figure, Elise Stefanik, who is now going to be the ambassador to the United Nations and therefore a cabinet official. Another dimension which we don't really address very well in our book is the need to reframe our global relationships. It's amazing to me that the right can actually be a global player and globalize their movements and talk to their bases in a way that is globalized. You only need to think about, Viktor Orban coming to address a conservative gathering in the United States. They have internationalized in a very successful way, and we haven't. So I'd like to come back to that point. And then finally, to sort of summarize how I think we come together, I think the word regathering, not regroupment so much, but regathering is an important concept. And this is something that I hope to explore together with Sandra and Charlie and other members of the Encuentro Cinco/Community Church community in a lot more detail. So let's go back to the book and the labor movement really quickly. 3 essays. One essay by Ben Mansky, who teaches at George Mason University. Ben Mansky is probably best known for his work with the Wisconsin Wave, in which they took over the Capitol building in a completely peaceful way, in contrast to January 6, 2020, where they took over the Capitol building in the state of Wisconsin to address the labor movement being disenfranchised by the governor of that time. But Ben has written an essay on how labor movements relate to the solidarity economy. So I'd really recommend people reading that. It looks at projects that the labor movement has funded, given that they are one of the few sources of funding for the left. And these include things like funding information technology projects, as well as different kinds of both worker and consumer cooperatives involving workers who are not unionized. So the labor movement beyond unions, but supported from within unions. Another essay we have is by Mike Miller, A Union for All Workers. Mike is a regional director, elected regional director of the United Auto Workers Union. I worked with Mike back in the early 1990s when we unionized the University of California system. Mike speaks about the fact that within the union, there was space for them to conduct conversations that are not traditional union or workplace or collective bargaining conversations. For example, the UAW members in Michigan were very impacted by what was happening to family members as Gaza was being destroyed. And so the labor movement became a place in which different segments of the working class could have a conversation about foreign policy and indeed pressure both the Biden administration and the future Harris campaign as to how they address the question. When UAW members were arrested and prosecuted with the support of the University of California, the UAW took up their case, their members being arrested. And these members were arrested because of the occupation of a quad over Palestine. They had occupied a quad, set up a tent city, and it was violently put down, not only by the not by the university police per se, but by outside agitators who had come in to physically attack peaceful protesters. So the UAW became a vanguard for conducting this conversation with the American people. I'm jumping now to the essay by Mark Spadafore, who's the chairperson of the Greater Syracuse Labor Council, right? And our book has a list of the different labor councils around the country in order that we may address them. Mark is also out of SEIU 1199, and he addresses the fact that their members include both rural members who are likely to vote Trump, as well as urban members who are likely, a lot of women of color members who are likely to vote Harris. So within their union, they had to find a space to have a conversation, and they were able to do so. He's in charge of political education for this region. They were able to do so by focusing on the issues that affect all union members and the fact that not enough money and resources was going to healthcare, whether it was workers and their facilities in the rural areas or in the urban areas. So the common thread from these three essays by Ben, Mike, and Mark is that within the union, there's space to conduct these difficult conversations. The question is the progressive movement sufficiently present in these unions to take advantage of this rare opportunity to bring together different parts of the conversation? Okay, so that was one point I wanted to make about bringing together people to have conversations. In other words, we build movements when we engage people who are not ourselves, who are outside of our common circles. And the labor movement seems to be one of the few places where that can happen. I think another place, and that's why I copied the titles to the essays by Helen Gim and Mary Traynor and Rebecca Garrard, are over housing and over public schools. Again, the progressive movement, which is concerned with a wide range of issues, needs to figure out what role, what weight do we have in movements for public housing. Our talk earlier in Charlie's talk, actually, he mentioned the need for public goods. How do we treat housing as a public good in a very literal kind of way? Is the model established by the Viennese Austro-Marxists during the period of Bauhaus movement in the 1920s of any value to us? Well, it turns out that in the United States, there are large numbers of people, small grouplets though, here and there in New York State and elsewhere, demanding public housing, but demanding public housing with the public developer model. In other words, instead of surrendering everything to large corporations who will invest in housing and provide maybe 10% of housing to as affordable housing for low-income folks, this is about the public sector renewing its commitment, as in Section 9, to public housing and becoming a developer on its own or working very closely, as does the city of Vienna and the state of Austria, with a large non-profit housing developers. So there are these models, there are these ideas, there are these movements. We need to figure out what's the overlap between these movements and the progressive movement, the left movement. I think much the same thing can be said for the excuse me, for the movement for public education. There are many ways to think about public education, but the more we establish our connection with public education particularly at the local and high school levels, the more we are forced to engage with real people as opposed to people who merely think like us. Public schools are important resources, as the mayor of Boston has recognized, as places where the community can come together and gather in times of weather or climate emergencies. They are also places which must be challenged to increase their relationships to communities. I'd like to move then to the point that I had made earlier around educational institutions really quickly, understanding educational institutions and the local community. It's likely, given the great success the right wing had at absolutely destroying the university presidents of University of Pennsylvania, Harvard University, and I think it was Columbia University, by calling them before Congress and having hearings on what was going on their campuses with the allegations of anti-Semitism, when the very opposite was true. Nonetheless, those university professors were presidents were placed on their back foot and could not reasonably respond to the charges before them, and as a result, three of them ended up resigning within months of that hearing. Given the success that Congress people had with making a spect out of university professors, I don't see them changing their tactics. I can imagine future conversations in which universities become a strategic institution which the right wishes to present before the Congress as an example of this or that deviation. How could the university presidents have responded differently? Well, I think the example that we should look to is the way Paul Robeson responded in defiance to the House Un-American Activities Committee, and the utter contempt that people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who spoke at the Community Church of Boston many times, the way they responded in the 40s and later in the 50s during the House Un-American Activities Committee. They were bold, they were defiant, and the reason they were able to do so, to walk into this hostile institution and be voices for justice, is one, they had deep connections to their base communities, people of color and the working class within the United States. And as importantly, if not more importantly, they had connections to a greater revolutionary world, the independence movements that were then very powerful in the global South, and of course the non-capitalist world that existed at that time. So what would be the latter-day equivalents of those relationships for these university presidents if they are to resist the far right? How can they do so, given that we don't have such equivalent powers as existed at the global scene in the 1940s and 50s? One, I would argue, is they have to reestablish their relationships with local communities. However, most universities tend to have frayed relationships, to put it mildly, with their local communities. If instead they were to cultivate their relationship with the local communities, utilizing their power as major investors in the local community, as people who could drive buying power for things like food, when you think of their dormitories, or when you think of the construction that happens on their campuses, they could establish their legitimacies, not as ivory towers, but as community-based institutions. And this is where I think, given the strong presence of the local of the progressive community on campuses, that I think some interesting things can happen. Taking the university as a strategic institution whereby we can conduct our resistance. It is also a place which, given the resources of the university, the mandate, the intellectual ambit of the university, we can think about reframing our global relationships. I think that the university many of the universities are in fact global universities with offices and campuses throughout the world. We need to, these tend to be the most rarefied places for the progressive parts of the university. We need to figure out how these can be regrounded, socialized in the public as we move forward. And I think that's where we can think about reframing the global relationships, including through the students who attend from other countries. I'd like to say a little bit more about the global relationships. Earlier, I spoke about Orban addressing a conservative gathering. So the right is able to talk about global issues to its base. We somehow, when we talk about it to our base, we tend to be siloed as the peace movement talking to the peace movement rather than to the broader movement. And we need to figure out how we can do what the right does, take our global issues and talk with other people about how the global relates to the local. It is shocking to me that we haven't really been able to talk about migration as something that is going to, and that currently affects the labor movement and other people in a meaningful way. We tend to talk about migration as the act of migration, and the problem is whether people have crossed borders legally or illegally. We don't look at the forces such as catastrophic climate breakdown or the economic relationships that force the imperialist economic relationships that force people off the land, out of the factories, and across borders. We need to be able to talk about those driving forces so that people are not forced to migrate against their will. This is an important topic because more than 1 billion people are predicted to move as a result of climate change by 2050. There's also internal migration that's going to happen within the United States, and we need to think about that. Our challenge is we no longer have either national or global platforms bringing together the whole left. The World Social Forum is a shadow of its former self, and we need to figure out how to regather. I'd like to close then with this idea of regathering. Regathering, I think, is a task that we all need to engage in. When I say we all need to engage in, I'm not talking about all of us individually. I'm talking about us using our institutions, be it the community church in Cuatro Cinco and all sorts of other organizations. We need to figure out how to reconnect with our bases in such a way that we can have a bigger conversation than the ones we've had to date. Instead of isolating ourselves, figuring out how it is we will expand. I think there are two concepts that are important that don't roll off the tongue very easily, but are worth rethinking and wondering and seeing if they're useful for us. I'll just end with this then. One is the concept of the everywhere border. One of the things that has happened with migration as a result of both the first Trump administration and second Trump administration is the marriage between the surveillance state and the border apparatus. When people talk about not building a wall and using more humane technologies, what they're talking about is the construction, which has happened already and is continuing, of massive databases that track people from when they're kids alleged to be in gangs through their migration throughout Mexico till they arrive at the US border and beyond. The US has these relationships with a large number of people. I'll share some books in the chat that I think address this topic. And I think that the everywhere border is the fact that the police powers of the Border Patrol have been generalized to operate throughout the world and throughout the United States. And we need correspondingly a new idea to address this. And one of those new ideas, I think, could be the idea of the everywhere sanctuary, where we establish sanctuary in such, we take the idea of sanctuary, which has sacred dimensions to it and very practical physical dimensions, and generalize it beyond church and educational institution, city borders, to think about expanding our individual and collective rights in ways that I believe will result in interesting battles both legal battles and practical shows of force between us and the coming Trump administration. So I'll share some four books that I think are important, four sources that I think are important for thinking about this in our chat. Let me stop sharing screen and then come back to you. So I'm going to stop sharing screen. And in the chat, I'm going to post 4 books as well as a website. And I believe that we need to explore these ideas. I think Encuentro Cinco, in its process of regathering, is going to be exploring this. And with that, I'd like to sort of turn back to Sandra and the community gathered at the church as well as online to get your responses to what Charlie and I have been speaking about.
Thank you very much, Suren, and thank you for so much information. I know we have been doing different activities, but more important, throughout the church, and I really love the concept of regathering, and mostly after the COVID situation, because really that isolates us a lot. But at the same time, give us a big opportunity. Like, for example, today we have about 14 people here gathered today, and I could start using gathering, so that we can just get more familiar with that. But also we have
Sorry, Sandra?
Yes.
I can't hear you. Can you keep the mic literally 1 centimeter from your...
Okay. And then also we have another people that are gathering virtually. Almost 36 people are joining us in our Zoom connection, plus all the people that are in our YouTube channel. So that show us the impact that we have in all these conversations. And with that, I would like to thank Suren and Professor Derber, but also remind you that the part that is modern break from the church also needs our help. So I would like to remind you that we not only accept cash checks, but also we have a digital form to collect money. You want to become a monthly sustainer. Can be as simple as think about it, inviting a cup of tea or cup of coffee to the church every month. Something simple will help and go a long way. And most after that, we had been almost 2 years without the first floor tenant. That definitely had created a vacuum in our budget. So locally, as I shared earlier, we just signed the lease. Of course, doesn't mean that we're going to have money immediately, but definitely it's going to be a process. And we are looking forward to share that with you, as well as sharing the basket, if you don't mind to pass it around. And also in the website, you will find a way to connect either through PayPal or through Selly or whatever other way. And with that, I would like to thank and ask Matt and Max if they can join us for our final song. And after that, we will go in questions and answers. And later, we will join, Luis will join us for lunch. So thank you.
We're going to start with a original of mine called Radio 1, and then that'll be followed by a Cole Porter standard called I Love Paris.
That's why a lot of people holding Mike Evans tickets.
Lining up in field, we're life-changing radio.
Thank you, Matt and Max, for joining us today. And please, let's give it another round of applause. Thank you. And I know that many of you already are in the list, in our email list, but if you are not, please feel free to add your name. We normally like to kind of like share and keep update every information that we have. So with that, I don't know if anybody wants the list, so everybody's in the, I will put it here. Okay, thank you. Now we can continue with questions and answers. I don't know if anybody want to make a question, and Amar will be very kind and tell us if there is any question in the Zoom or in the YouTube. Okay. I will be passing the mic.
Yes, on my part, just a quick question. I'd like to know what the prospects are for organizing another World Social Forum. I think that was a good vehicle in the past to facilitate people's gathering and developing, some kind of response to the global crisis.
Suren, Professor Derber.
Charlie, do you want to go first?
Well, Suren, you're the right person to address this.
Okay, sure. Literally, I've been following the conversations toward reconstructing the World Social Forum, and I'm not optimistic that the current process is adequate to it. I think that regional fora may have to precede the construction of another World Social Forum. I think that the original steam that drove the World Social Forum, which was really the electoral victories in Latin America, those victories are now very one that the original pink tide has receded, gone through a round of reaction, and what has come back is very, very hard to discern. I'm sure that this is a topic, John, you're better versed in than I am, but you can think about the electoral victories in Colombia and Chile, as well as in Brazil, as having confusing outcomes. Venezuela, which was a point of unity, is no longer a point of unity. And so we need to think about how, what we can be doing both at our local area, in our local areas, to convene international forces, because there are people from all these different countries constructing local fora with a view to a future World Social Forum. The resources it takes, as well as the legal environment, are also very complex things, right? At its height, the World Social Forum brought together between 150,000 to 200,000 people to Porto Alegre. I can't imagine a left-wing government capable of doing that, or having the not only the capacity, but the political will to do so. So, and the other element to the legal framework is, to what extent borders are going to be closed to these kinds of conversations. The in-person nature of the World Social Forum added a great deal of value that the current virtual conversations don't offer. So I think that the question has to be how we build at the local level. In the chat, there was a question about, how we deal with the fact of homelessness. What are we doing as individuals to people who are children and others? Now, I didn't address this question in my presentation, but a lot of us are involved in building local land trusts, as well as serving community kitchens and all. Our question needs to be, how do we tie together these diverse efforts to build it into something bigger? So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Suren. And Charlie has his hand up. Charlie, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I owe this question to listening to a presentation by Roy Casagrande on the Austin School, which I highly recommend. I'll put a reference to it in the chat. But he pointed out that right now there are more refugees than any time in history, including after World War II, which gives you the scope of the problem. And half of those refugees are Muslim, mainly due to U.S. wars. And that took me back, you know, and things are bad, but it's further confirmation of this link between war and militarism and the environment, which is also responsible for another huge chunk of the refugees. And I just wanted to say that out loud, just that it's, you know, of course it's been through the Democratic and Republican administrations, and I can't see anything being done about it seriously soon.
I just want to make one comment about that. I teach at Boston College, which is a pretty conservative campus, but we have a global public health program called Global Public Health and the Common Good. And one of the people involved who you might want to bring to one of these meetings, this woman named Shelley White. She and her husband, Jonathan White, are both sociologists who work about 3 months on the border and in Arizona. And they are, like this spring, every spring and every fall, they take a group of students to the border and essentially interact over a couple of weeks with a variety of activist organizations on the border, introducing students to the kind of work that's being done there and the kinds of needs that are incredibly intense. And just one thing I wanted to mention in response to your comment is that on campuses which are often quite passive, the migration issue and the deportation and the general crisis of migration that, you know, Suren was addressing, and which everybody's fully aware of, going to burst out on January 20th. It's a major issue. It surprised me, but that the students on many campuses appear to be very, very resonant and responsive to that issue. So that gives me a little hope that, you know, beyond the Gaza and the kind of focus on the horrific genocidal kinds of conflicts we're dealing with, I'm struck by a rising interest in migration issues on campuses. So I just think that's another note of hope that we can look forward to as Trump begins to really tighten the screws on this.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay, Paul?
Hi, Charlie and Suren.
Oh,
lot of questions here. The first thing I'll mention is this regathering process. 15 to 20 organizations in Greater Boston are pulling together a conference on the Sunday before the inauguration to begin a process of regathering to try to figure out how to orient ourselves to the new administration that's coming in, given everything that will be faced. I notice a lot of the focus is on protecting ourselves from Trump and kind of resisting things he's doing, but I'm wondering whether either of you see any possible new openings that might be available to the movement with Trump that were not available to us because of the complex relationship we have with the Democratic Party and how that paralyzed us to act in strong ways and to pull pull people away from the Democratic Party into a different formation.
Thank you.
Ren, why don't you, and then I'll.
Sure. So, Paul, I think that you're probably better placed to answer the question you've just posed. However, I'll give it a stab, a heroic gesture on my part. I think that the turbulence that's likely to come with the new administration is going to likely create openings as well as atrocities, and we're going to have to figure out how at the local level we can build the kind of solidarity needed to address the atrocities as well as take advantage of the openings. So at that abstract level, let's move forward a little bit. I think the fact of resistance to any kind of mass deportation requires us to create new forms of organization, replicate old ones, and strengthen our level of organization. The act of that resistance is itself, I think, going to create the organizational wherewithal for future openings beyond mere resistance. The relationship to the Democratic Party has obviously bedeviled our movement, at least since the 1930s, with even with the New Deal, which introduced segregation, excluded domestic and agricultural workers. All of that meant that the communities we often, as people to the left of the Democratic Party, care more about, we've never really been able to solve it. I do think, though, that, and this is where I think our collection, How We Win, might be useful, that there are projects within the labor movement as well as elsewhere that allow us to recollect, to rebuild relationships that go well beyond what the Democratic Party has, and in fact that may exist outside, that may in the future exist independently of the Democratic Party. I think the either-or logic has been something that has failed us. The logic of absolute unanimity with the Democratic Party has also failed us. We need to figure out a way that we can be strategic, to have a strategically ambiguous relationship with the Democratic Party. In other words, developing our own bases and then choosing how we want to relate to the Democratic Party or any other party on a case-by-case basis. The emphasis being developing our bases. And I think that, look, Paul, you, I, Charlie, most people in the room are veterans of many attempts at regathering. Let's try to figure out how we can do it differently. The biggest weakness we've always had is, despite good personal relationships with figures in the labor movement, we've never been able to establish really organic ties to the labor movement. I think this time is different in that many of the people, like generationally, that we would have worked with are now in the leadership of many of the trade unions, and therefore there are opportunities there to conduct joint campaigns. And also trade unions will see their memberships affected by any attempt to do a mass deportation, thinking about Laborers International Union of North America and other people in the building trades and elsewhere. The thing is whether or not we have the wherewithal to deal with things we disagree with within the labor movement and yet still work with them. Again, this idea of strategic ambiguity, I think, is going to be important for us. There's a lot more to be said about the Democratic Party, and many of you have said it, and we'll probably have to agree to disagree. My last point with respect to this and the problematic relationship with the Democratic Party versus our rebuilding is as follows. I think we really do need to figure out, and I think DSA, even though it has been very divided and in fact hamstrung by the question of Palestine, not the question of Palestine, but how we relate to Palestine while dealing with Democratic Party, DSA members of the Democratic Party who are not as, or not quite on the same page as we are with respect to Palestine. We need to figure out how to conduct local elections for the county and city level. And I think that that is very possible for us to take advantage of those local races. And because all these national questions will have local, a need for a local buy-in, whether it's about attracting investment or collaboration between local police forces and the Border Patrol. All of these things, I think, create opportunities for us to be very active and aggressive. Charlie?
Yeah, Paul, I just say how lovely it is to hear your voice. I'm eager to hear you talk to this issue that you just raised and hope we can get together soon, Paul. I just want to footnote Suren's response that I think what the election has done has sort of highlighted the crisis that the Democratic Party and the left more generally has, particularly in relation to class politics. You know, I mean, everybody in the media and commentators are talking over and over again about how much the working class in the United States migrated over to Trump. This is, of course, something that's been going on for 40 years or so. And the Democratic Party and the left, in my judgment, bear a great deal of responsibility for this because ever since the neoliberal Reagan Revolution, the Democratic Party, starting with Clinton and continuing with Obama, really moved toward a kind of identity politics, Paul, that you and I talked about a lot, that has really severed relationship between both the Democratic Party and the working class, and I think the left more generally and the working class. So the opportunity I see here is that everybody is now thinking about this issue, which is, how does the progressive movement and any revived left in this country relate to the working class? What is the base of the Democratic Party, and particularly do ordinary workers who are 60% non-college workers, 60% of voters, and who, very strongly for Trump, how does the progressive community relate to that demographic? And that includes Hispanic and some Black voters as well, who moved over a bit toward Trump, Hispanics very dramatically so. So I think the opportunity here is a new conversation about something that the left has not been willing, certainly the Democratic Party, this shift toward DEI and identity politics and the abandonment of any real focus on class, the abandonment of a focus on militarized capitalism, which in my view is the center of both the extinction issues I was talking about before and the political issues that we're facing right now. And so I see honestly, a real opportunity on campuses in labor, the shift of labor onto organizing on campuses, the corporatization of the university. There's a kind of new set of opportunities here now, which are not just resistance to Trump. It's like reorienting how people on the left think about what they're doing, think about what progressive left politics is about. And I think for 40 years, we've answered that question and created a wide open window for working people to move over to the Republicans. And now that Trump is in and he's, enshrining a corporate oligarchy, the guys like Ramaswamy and up to 12 billionaires he's already put in his cabinet. There's a real opportunity for progressives left for building up a new coalition between the working class and the quote PMC, the professional manager, meaning student, social service workers who are going to be under great pressure with Project 2025 and so forth. So I actually see quite a lot of opportunity, but it involves not just resistance, that's very, very important, but really rethinking in a very basic way what we're doing, what the left is really about, and what our fundamental aims are.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay, Antoine?
Hello, my name is Antoine. Thank you very much for all the information and presentation. I had to reformulate my question because the question I wanted to ask was answered in the long explanations from Suren and the other gentleman. Based on this, we are in most of this chat stating the obvious that we all as leftists know. So the question, instead of saying what happened, what is going to happen, and what's happening, is we know the working class has been swayed. We know the left is extremely weak and ineffective in this nation, and we know the Democrats are basically Republicans with a knife and not a gun. With this being said, my question is not what can we do, but what must be done every day by every single human. What would be your recommendation of 3 direct actions every single person can take in order to make the movement grow daily? Everyone always talks about the commitment, but it is a daily task. Trump was elected because we did not were doing our work daily, and he is now president for the 2nd time. So what can you recommend that people do at least once a day in order to improve this work? And that's my question.
Shall I also attempt to answer a very difficult question, but a necessary question, Charlie, and then you could provide your 3?
Yeah, absolutely, Corinne.
Okay. Antoine, thank you for the question. I think that, forgive me if I sound arrogant, right? I think that people in the American left are very used to asking the question, what must I do? What can I do? And when they ask that question, they often are limited by their personal resources and the people they know. I think the more interesting question, if you'll forgive my arrogance, right, is what can I do to combine my energies with other people? In other words, what is going to be the organizational framework that will allow me to take the meager resources I have and make it useful toward building power for the left? So I think that's the way we need to frame it, right? Our power in and through other people in an organized way. Putting it differently then, right? How do I take my $10 a month donation to, say, monthly review and convert it into something much more than that? I'm able to do that because monthly review has the right kind of program to accept the money and grow. The question is, you know, do our local organizations have this power? To put it a bit differently, last night I was reading a book by someone working on climate change, and the entire book was about what to say to this or that person. The question that this professor did not answer, though, was who am I and where am I saying it? And I think that what we do has to be then preceded by a set of questions. Who am I? What are my connections? And how do those connections allow me to increase my power? So if you'll forgive this abstract non-answer, that's all I have to offer, Antoine. We know each other, and you know that we do work together, or we've done work in the past together. I think projects that we're commonly involved in, whether it's the Boston May Day Coalition and others, and what we do in these coalitions or with Encuentro Cinco is what we should be doing when we get to work with each other. Charlie?
So Antoine, thank you very much for this question. In a way, I really appreciate that question directly because, you know, as I talk about extinction, we're all such great deniers. You know, we distance ourselves in many different ways from, when you ask the question, what can we do every day? I think that's the right question in many ways. It would, you know, it is, because it's only by engagement that we'll begin to make a difference and a stronger difference. So I'll just give you one answer from Antoine from my own experience. So I'm teaching on a conservative campus. I've been on a university campus for 50 years. I've never had a dean. I teach a course called Peace or War. I had the deans when talking about Palestine, call me in, want to see my syllabus, and went through a bit of a ringer, which as a lot of students did on campus. And I'm just every day creating a climate, but confronting a climate that I've never seen before on university campuses, where administrators being pushed by wealthy donors are intervening in the curriculum, making it impossible for students to put up a poster, people to walk through campus with a sign. So I'm on a campus every day. So I actually am in a position to do something every day, because just to give you one concrete example, Antoine, it won't seem very impressive, but I noticed at my university here at Boston College, during the election, none of the political science professors, according to my students, ever talked about the election. They never used their class as a forum for engaging this new generation on the incredible path that we're looking at here. And so I spent much of my classes talking about relating all the themes. I teach about political economy, so it was easy for me, but so do political scientists. And they said nothing. They did nothing. I don't know how they would answer your question, even the more progressive ones. For me, I love your question because it kind of reminds me that we do have, in the various settings we have, opportunities to do something. Sometimes it's a bit risky. Sometimes you face opposition from the very people that you're trying to talk with. But I just feel like we all have access every day to people around us, in our workplace, in the neighborhood, in any setting that you're in, when you go to a coffee house or whatever, to talk to people. And I think it begins by simply doing something, by connecting and talking about these kinds of issues that everybody who's listening to this conversation is thinking about all the time. We're all thinking about the same questions, kind of questions Paul raised, are questions that every one of us is thinking about. And I think we're living in this culture which discourages reaching out. And I do agree with Suren very much. This is a question of congregating and gathering and connecting. I've just finished a new book, which is about the crisis of the breakdown of social relationships and the kind of loneliness, isolation, disconnection that the culture and the economy is driving us toward. And so when I think about your question, Antoine, I think about, trying every day to go over that gap in connection and connect with people about critical issues that I know are on people's minds. So conservative students on this campus that you might think I would have a lot of trouble talking to, I talk to them every day, every time I see them. And I just like your question. I think people should be asking this question all the time. What can I do today?
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Suren. One more question? Hold on.
It's not a question in particular, but I'd like to make an announcement. There will be a mobilization in Boston in defense of migrants. And it's not like a general thing about migrant rights. It's a mobilization that will be demanding no deportations and no raids, and to stop the abuse of power, which we know is coming. There's over a dozen organizations involved in this, and they will be mobilizing at Government Center, particularly by the JFK Federal Building, at 3 o'clock. This will be on the 20th of January when Trump is inaugurated. And it's also when Martin Luther King Day will be celebrated. I mean, to have a contradiction. But anyway, there is something happening in Boston on Inauguration Day, and I hope folks can attend. If you want more info, we can talk later. But thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. It seems that there are no more questions, and I want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity. Seems that there is no more questions. Oh, Paul? Okay, Paul.
Charlie and Suren, I'm going to take a second crack at you here. Immigration. There's a lot of issues in which people are running circles around us. But I think if there was one issue that was paramount to developing the type of reaction in U.S. society, both in the Democrats and Republicans, and around the world, it's the fact that we have no answer that rings true to people about how to deal with this crisis. And so as a result, we have immigration being able to be used to move the world society in very negative directions, at the same time that the neoliberal order is collapsing. That neoliberalism has set off these problems for working people, for all kinds of people. So we have these two things coming together. The collapse of neoliberalism in Europe and in the United States. More and more people reacting to it, moving toward Trump, moving toward that whole movement. And at the same time, an increasing problem of immigration and all these other problems that's setting off. What is where do we find a way of responding effectively to the present options that are available and are leading us to these dangerous directions? What is our messaging on this issue that would be effective in giving people a different perspective on it, as opposed to just a moral approach to it, that you can't treat people like this?
Thank
So,
you.
Paul, I'll start, Suren, if that's all right with you. Paul, this is another one of those easy questions you always raise for us to think about. I'm glad you mentioned Europe, because it's challenged my own preconceptions, which was that the ability to demonize, people, particularly immigrants, people who are not true patriots or true citizens, which is the sort of heart of fascism in many ways, is usually based in economic crisis. We're in a neoliberal crisis. But in Europe, you have much stronger, despite, the neoliberal tide, particularly in finance in Germany and in the EU, moving in a more neoliberal direction. The immigrant crisis is creating a major far-right catastrophe throughout Europe. And it's really challenging as a question, because I had always assumed that if you had enough social democracy, that is enough social welfare, enough labor power and so forth, let's say the minimal form that Europe has been able to build up over the last 50 years or so, that it would cushion the power of immigration, buffer the power of immigration as a political and emotional weapon for the far right. It hasn't. In Europe, despite the kinds of social democratic and labor gains that have been institutionalized, to the point that the far right is not attacking a lot of those social democratic gains in the social welfare system, in the labor system, and so forth. Nonetheless, the immigration crisis is still pushing us toward a global Suren was so right to focus us on the ability of the far right to sort of take the global system and sort of organize the far right around a common set of immigration, particularly focusing on immigration, but more generally. And I think this is our biggest problem. And I don't think we have easy answers. My initial approach for thinking about this, Paul, is to focus on the economic implications. You know, if you take, if you were to do the level of millions of people being deported that Trump talks about, which he won't be able to do, but he'll do, a large number, it's going to have significant implications on the economy. It's going to create massive price increases in, it's sort of like a COVID-2 based on immigration. You're going to be eliminating the labor supply in a lot of agriculture, in housing, in building construction, and so forth. So my general take on this, which is related to my previous comment about the broader shift in learning, the left learning to think about class and economics rather than simply opening the door to cultural identity politics, is to think about immigration as an economic issue. And that's a vehicle through which you can connect with the working class and with the population in general. I mean, Trump's combination of, if he does universal tariffs, and he then combines that with a very significant, just in his first term, he had a crisis. He had to give billions of dollars to farmers. There's going to be an people are complaining about the price of groceries. That's going to intensify under the hard immigration regime. There's not an easy answer for that. There are not enough Americans who will do that kind of agricultural work. There's also a real crisis around housing, another area where, working people voted Republican. So I think that Democrats and the left together would be well advised to think about immigration as an economic issue and to sort of use it as leverage. Pointing out the people who are gaining from immigration, the B1, H1B visas, people like Musk and Ramaswamy, the high-tech bros, they are the people benefiting from the kind of immigration they're imposing. So they're opening the door to a kind of economic conversation, which I think a lot of even Trump base supporters are going to have, they're going to be against Ramaswamy and Musk on this issue. And the left may be able to portray a kind of working class economic thing focused on everyday prices and the labor market, which I think might reach a fair, it might be one of the, immigration might, if we're really lucky and creative, be a vehicle by which we can reach the working class and also reach students on campuses and, young people and the intelligentsia who think about it more in a moral lenses. But I think the key is thinking about the economic implications, which are going to be very severe, of the kind of crackdown on immigration that Trump is going to do.
I don't know if I have more to add to this question than Charlie does, but I want to say two things about the way Paul framed the question. One, I don't think it's a problem for us to take moral stands. And I think we need moral clarity, but that shouldn't be, that shouldn't divide us. We need to figure out, once we've settled on a viewpoint, what the right strategy is. Once we have a viewpoint, we need to look at the organizations we're talking from within in order to figure out what is the correct strategy for this organization. For example, the question of immigration can be framed as simply the movement of people, but it could also be framed as a question of the way in which investments move. If I was sitting at the head of a workers' pension fund, would I be different than Paul looking out the window of Community Church at Boylston Street? What is the vision based on where we are? And so I think the conversation needs to be less abstract when we come to talk about strategy, but we need to have absolute moral clarity that the rights of people who are here should not be abrogated in any way, whether they cross the border with documentation or not. That has to be like non-negotiable. After that, we need to figure out how do we appeal to broader sectors of the working class. Among the ways we appeal to broader sectors of the working class is to recognize that migration is going to be happening within the United States too. right? People are going to move from areas of climate disaster to another. I remember when Puerto Rico was hit, many people moved into this upstate New York community in which I live right now in Syracuse, New York. They never left afterward. So we need to figure out how we welcome people from outside our immediate communities. And if we want to figure that out, we need to ask, well, what kind of organization am I in? And that will allow us to figure out our response to it. So I don't think there can be an abstract question about how we respond to immigration without first stating where we are looking at this question from. One of the organizations, I shared some books with you, including a book written by Mzue Iseki in the chat. And one of the things they're doing is partnering with organizations in the global south that actually are part of sending communities and figuring out how local economic development takes place. There's a professor at Suffolk University who has just published a book called Constructed Movements, came out a few days ago. Constructed Movements, and I've just spaced on her name, but look up the book Constructed Movements. Looks at Mexican movements, which involve not just people staying in one place, but people who keep moving back and forth, figuring out how they move back and forth and what their vision of the world is. It's not a moral vision of migration. It's a view of migration with a view to becoming partners with this part of the working class that is hypermobile because of how capital has broken down the borders, right? There's something else we need to think about. President Trump is able to partner with Bukele on a vast militaristic scheme, and they want to generalize that. Fortunately, Colombia and some other countries have rejected that kind of partnership. However, we need to think about how can we partner with progressive governments, like, even if we disagree with dimensions of their work, like Sheinbaum's government in Mexico City, in Mexico right now, as well as Mexico City itself. They have innovative models at the urban level for development and for keeping people, for allowing people to live and prosper where they are, as opposed to being forced to migrate. So we need a broader vision, a broader education of ourselves in order to understand what migration is and how it opens up possibilities for talking to the rest of the working class. Otherwise, if we frame it in purely moral terms, it will remain a wedge issue that will get slapped about, just as Palestine has allowed itself, not Palestine, but how Palestine has become an issue, a wedge issue, which defeats us.
Thank you, Suren. One last question, please.
It's good to be here with you. I think that it's pretty depressing and discouraging what's going on in the world, but to start at one point, whatever it is for each one of us, where we can start to build something different, something new. I think the economy is definitely key to what's going on, and so a shout out for creating public banks where we take control of our own tax dollars to begin to create the world that we want. I attended many World Social Forums where we talked about creating the world that we want. And so I think that the movements around the country, including here in Massachusetts, to create public banks is really important. It gives me hope in a world that I find very distressing. And I will give a shout out for East Bay, California, where they have created the first public bank since the Bank of North Dakota. And I hope we'll have many more around the world. So it's just one example of how to find a spot of hope and constructive resistance in beginning to build a different world. So thank you both so much.
Thank you very much for that. If I could just make a quick comment. I'm dealing with a lot of young people who, because they're paying $100,000 to come to school, are thinking about going to Wall Street. And what's interesting is that even these young people are in the age of billionaires and the kind of overt kind of ripping off of ordinary people that very wealthy people are up to, and the neoliberal climax now with the greatest inequality ever in the world. I think your point about public banks is going to find a very resonant audience, among people who you might not expect it from. I think there's a lot of polling that suggests that the amount of public anger around Wall Street, which, by the way, has always been a subject of critique from much of the far right. Look at a history of the far right in the United States. The attack on Wall Street was always a very central part of many of these movements. I think under Trump, the attack on the billionaire class is going to become very intense, and it's going to find an audience not just on the left, but among a very large sector of the population, a supermajority that just can't stand how awful, finance, private equity, Wall Street, because they understand how it's impacting their price of food and housing and rent and so forth. So I just want to thank you for bringing up that idea of a public bank, and to say that, it's ironic, but in this moment of horror, there are going to be opportunities. And the idea of public bank in the face of overt, overwhelming oligarchic tyranny is going to find more seeds than you might think. So I have hope for that kind of possibility.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate your attendance today and all these rich questions. And thank you, Suren. Thank you, Charlie, for your time and the inspiration to gather together. So let's keep doing that. Thank you, everybody. And please join us for lunch.